Chapter 6. The Country. They drove for a couple more miles before hitting a small town. Nate pulled down the one main street and parked on the side. I need to stock up on some supplies. They have a small store over there if you need anything. Meet me back here in 10 minutes. He told her as he exited the car. He walked swiftly down the sidewalk. Paige watched him a couple minutes before peeling herself out the car. Nathaniel made his way to the small gun store at the corner. He stood by the door a moment to take in the room's layout and who was there. Nate then grabbed a small hand basket, making his way down the main aisle. He began to fill it up with bullets and other things. The store manager watched him as he walked around. "Afternoon, sir," he said, smiling. Nate cracked a fake smile to be polite. The man smiled back and watched him. Nate could feel the man's eyes watching him as he walked down the aisle. Meanwhile, Paige made her way down to the store he had mentioned. She picked up some toiletries, amongst other things she would need. She rounded the corner and noticed the hair dye. Nate told her she needed to change her appearance, and this was all she could think of. She stood motionless, looking at the small selection. She really didn't want to dye her hair, but she had no choice. She glanced down at her golden locks and then at the boxes. Paige didn't know which one to pick or even how to use it. She always had a hairdresser. Frustrated, she grabbed a box and tossed it in the basket. Nathaniel placed the full basket on the counter. The man looked at him strangely. "That's a lot of ammo, son." He chuckled as he struggled to scoot the basket closer to him. Nate nodded and gazed around the store as he rang up his order. The man finally finished and called out his order. Nathaniel pulled out a wad of cash and paid him. The man counted out his change, then slid the heavy bags towards Nathaniel. "Good luck hunting, son." The man smiled as Nate grabbed the bags. Paige pushed the heavy basket towards the checkout. It was full of food and other things. She placed them on the belt and pushed the empty basket towards the front. The young cashier began to check her out. Paige waited quietly as the girl rang her up. Paige watched each item get scanned and placed in the bag. Her eyes traveled to her name badge. Heather was her name. Paige noticed Heather looking at her. She smiled faintly back at her. Nathaniel strutted into the store and over to her. The cashier cracked a smile and batted her eyes. Nate didn't pay her any mind. Nate bent over closer to Paige's ear. "You got you some better shoes, I hope?" he asked, looking down at her pumps. She looked down and then to him. "Yes," she answered him. Nate noticed the cashier still staring at him. He looked at Heather, a little freaked out by her stares. "I'll be in the car," he said to Paige, still watching the cashier gawk at him. Heather winked, flirting, as she bagged their things. Nate's eyes widened, and he made a face. He then walked out and could still feel the cashier's eyes on him. Paige also watched him walk out before putting the things in the basket. The cashier finished, and Paige paid her before walking out. Nathaniel popped the trunk and helped Paige put the bags inside. They left the basket on the curb and got in the car. "Need to get going. It will be dark soon. And we have an hour drive," Nate said, sliding in the driver's seat. Paige nodded and got in the passenger's seat. They buckled up and headed out of town. The hour drive was a silent one. Nate kept his eyes straight on the road, while Paige watched the trees pass. The sun started to set, painting the sky bright orange and pink. Paige always wanted to come to the country, she just wished it was under a better situation. If it would have been her father driving, they would have talked about old times, but instead sat estranged. The awkward silence lasted the whole way. As they drove, the trees grew thicker and hid the moon from her gaze. Nate finally turned off the main road onto a dirt one. A couple more miles and he turned again onto a long gravel driveway. In the distance she could see the light of a cabin. He parked in front of it and turned the car off. Popping the trunk, Nate stepped out of the car and began to unload it. Paige slowly got out of the car and looked around. They were in the middle of the woods, out in the middle of nowhere. Crickets chirped and the air was fresher. She noticed him bringing the items inside, so she walked over to the trunk and helped him. The cabin was a nice size, but she couldn't make it out. The only light they had on was the security motion light. It only lit a small path. Paige was a bit nervous. She had never been out in the woods like this. Anything could be lurking here. She shuddered at the thought. Nathaniel watched her shoo away a bug. This was my last client's cabin. He would sometimes bring his mistress up here. Nate told her as he walked up the small steps and opened the door. It obviously had been locked up a long time. The air was musty. Nate walked in a little ways and scattered the bags on the kitchen floor. Paige stood by the door for a moment. Nate turned the kitchen light on for her to see. So, there should be some clothes for you here. He finished his sentence and went to walk out back to the car. Your client won't come back here? She asked as Nathaniel laughed. She was shocked to hear him laugh. No, he won't, he said, stepping over the bags, opening the door. Why? She asked. Nate turned to face her with the door handle in his hand. His wife paid me to kill him. It's one bedroom, so I'll take the couch, he said, pointing towards the room. He walked outside to get the rest of the things. Paige dug in the bags looking for a bit of clothes she bought and the hair dye. She found them and put them all in the same bag. She made her way through the cabin. The kitchen and living room were open and connected. Walking down the small step toward the living room, she noticed the couch and the fireplace. She walked over to the mantel where some pictures were lying face down. Paige went to lift one of them up out of curiosity, but was startled by Nate bringing in more bags. She let go of the picture and walked across to the bedroom. Nate watched her walk briskly into the bedroom and close the door. He looked over to where she was standing, then to the floor. He probably should have moved the previous owner's stuff out, but never had time to. Plus, he didn't know he would be bringing anyone up here. He brushed it off and started to pick up the groceries. Paige turned the light on and looked around the tiny room. A queen-size bed with a small nightstand and lamp. It looked cozy enough. It was not fancy like the Ritz Hotel, but it would do. Paige thought it was quite nice and didn't mind it at all. She walked over to the small closet and opened the doors. A couple of pairs of pants, shirts and a dress hung up inside, nothing too special. Paige closed the doors and backed up, sitting on the bed. She bounced a bit but then settled. She reached down and took off her heels. Paige tossed them on the wooden floor, and they clinked as they rolled. She frowned at them, rubbing her feet. Paige needed a bath. The stinking heartache of the day lay heavy on her ivory skin and clothing. Paige grabbed her clothes and hair dye, and made her way into the small bathroom inside the room. She turned the light on and closed the door. She then sat the box of hair dye on the tiny porcelain sink. Paige tossed her clothes on the toilet that sat next to the sink. She then turned and walked a short distance to the tub. Paige slowly turned the silver knobs and watched the water flow freely out. She then lifted the handle for the shower to turn on. Nate finished picking up the groceries and tossed the empty bags in the trash. He then walked towards the center of the room where the table sat. He pulled the chair out of the way and bent down to pick up the bags of ammo. Gently sitting the bags on the small wooden table, Nate reached his hands inside, taking the boxes out and laying them down. He then turned and walked to the living room. He bent down and picked up his military duty bag and flung it on the couch. Then he bent down again, picking up another, larger bag. He paused when he heard Paige start the shower. He looked again toward the bedroom, then back at the bag in his hands. He knew he was going to have to tell her who he was and who he worked for, more like used to work for. Nate still couldn't believe he betrayed Marina in the cause like this, but he never supported her stupid plans. At first it was just a job, a way off the streets, but now he was fed up with it. The blood, bullets, and violence were starting to get to the ex-Navy SEAL. Nate picked up the heavy bag and brought it to the table. He then sat it on the ground beside him, and reached up to turn on the light that hung over the table. He used his foot to scoot the chair closer to him, so he could sit. Nathaniel sat down and dug in his bag. He removed a couple of handguns and laid them on the table. Paige opened the box of dye and read the directions. She then placed the gloves on and began to dye her hair. The water started to heat up and make the room steamy, her image in the mirror becoming cloudy from the steam. She wiped the steam off and looked at the dye that stained her dress. "Great, Paige." She fussed at herself. The dye didn't matter. The dress was already ruined from the whole Derek and highway fiasco. She took a deep breath, trying to push it all out of her mind. If she kept focusing on the danger, she would run herself mad with worry. Paige threw the empty bottle and box in the trash. She took off the gloves and threw them away, too. She then slipped off her dress. She picked it up and looked at it. She studied each tear and stain before tossing it as well. Nate placed most of the ammo into the bag at his feet. His mind focused on the task at hand, or at least he tried. The sound of the shower constantly reminded him he wasn't alone. He shook it off and opened the gun oil. He then laid an old stained towel down in front of him and sat his Glock on top. He began to take the guns apart, placing each part in a nice line. He looked down the barrel and blew through it. Paige finally jumped in the shower and washed up quickly. The water stung her skin knees, but she needed to clean them. Dirt, dried blood and hair dye circled down the drain slowly. Paige watched it swirl as it went down. She washed her hair and body. When the last of the soap was washed off, she reached down and turned off the water. It dripped a few times before stopping. Paige stepped out on the rug and grabbed the towel, wrapping it around her. She then walked to the mirror again. She reached up and wiped the condensation from it. Her hair was no longer blonde, but a dark brunette instead. She looked totally different. Paige was a whole new person in her eyes. Paige quickly dressed in pajamas and walked out of the bedroom. The steam followed her out as she made her way into the living room. Nathaniel was sitting at the table, still cleaning his guns. The smell of the gun oil floated in the room. It was strong and almost made her cough, but he was used to it. She walked over and sat at the table. Paige's hair was still a little wet, and it dripped on her arms. She rubbed the drops off and tied her hair in a ponytail. Nathaniel reassembled his gun and clicked it shut. The noise of the metal echoed and made her jump. He then sat it in front of her. "Before you learn to use this, you need to learn to care for it. This could mean the life or death of you. If your tools don't function properly, you end up dead." Paige studied it before picking it up. The shiny metal gleamed in the light. She turned it over in her hands. She had never held a gun before. It was quite heavier than she expected. "Here." He held out his hand and she gave it back. He then explained to her how to take it apart and put it back together. He clicked it again and Paige only jumped slightly this time. He handed it back for her to try. Paige slowly fooled with it, slowly taking it apart. Nathaniel watched her for a moment and then got up. He walked to the kitchen to grab something to drink. Paige dropped a piece on the floor. "Crap," she fussed at herself and bent over to look on the floor for it. Nate cracked a smile behind his water bottle when he heard the metal hit the floor. "This will take some time," he thought to himself as he walked back towards her. "Need help?" he asked. Paige bumped her head on the table. "Ah," she said, holding her head. No, I got it," she mumbled, sitting up straight and putting it back together. She looked up at him as he stood in front of her. Paige bit the inside her lip and fumbled with it. Nate sat his water bottle down and walked to the side of her. He reached down to show her what she was doing wrong. His hand brushed against her thumb. Paige tried not to blush as she watched him. She watched his hands show her what to do. He then took it apart and made her start over. Paige nodded and reassembled it with ease this time. He was impressed with her. She was a quick learner. "Paige, I need to tell you something. The guy Derek worked for, more like woman, she is working with Mr. Green. They want to make some worldwide criminal organization. That woman is who I work for. She sent me to keep an eye on the other two idiots." Nate looked over at Paige. She had the gun gripped under her hand so hard it was shaking. If she would pick it up and try to shoot him, he would understand, but she didn't. Nate began to explain his time in Mexico and how he met Marina. He told his tale all the way up to where he met her. I never knew you were the daughter of the man who William was after, nor did I have anything to do with it. I only heard of you when my old Navy buddy gave me a call. His son told him about me. He asked if that was right. Paige nodded. Yay, I asked Xavier to get me some help. Her voice was raspy. Good. Let's finish this tomorrow. It's late and you have an early morning, he said, reaching for his water again. She slowly got up from the table, leaving the gun. He was even taller, now that she had the heels off. He looked down at her and watched her slowly creep by him. Nate watched her walk into the room slowly. He waited for her to close the door before he made his way into the living room. He went to the front door to make sure it was locked. He took one last peek outside and walked to the kitchen, turning off the lights. He then made his way to the couch. He plopped down and took his boots off, tossing them to the side, and then removing his shirt. He then tossed that on top of his shoes. He reached up and scratched a Taurus tattoo that marked his left pec and shoulder. He then ran his hand through his hair and lay back on the couch. He placed his hands behind his head and stared up at the ceiling, thinking about the hell of a day he had. He looked towards the room, noticing the light still on. She took it better than he thought. He was afraid he was gonna get a bullet or two, but he needed to tell her the truth and get it out of the way. Paige lay in the bed covered up. She would glance every now and then to the door. It was slightly ajar, so she could hear him moving around. She slowly reached up and turned off the lamp and lay there in the dark. Her mind flooded her with thoughts. Nate works for the very people responsible, but now he was helping her. Paige only hoped he was and not trying to double-cross her. She sighed before closing her eyes to pray. God, I need a whole lot of help if he is here to help. Great and thank you. But if he is a snake in the garden, please reveal it to me. She continued to pray before drifting off to sleep. Chapter 7. The preacher's words kept circling in his head. Sin keeps you longer than you want to stay and leads you farther than you want to go. It was true. Every day, JJ was getting deeper and deeper in a hole, and he knew he would end up 6 feet under. He tried to drive the words out of his mind with the song on the radio, but it was no use. He turned the radio off and sighed deeply. "And that simple Skynerd." Johnny spoke to himself in the radio as he pulled into the motel. The Cajun parked and sat there looking at the red door in front of his truck. Then glanced down at his wet and blood-stained clothes. He slowly pressed his forehead to the steering wheel to calm his nerves. JJ, you need to stop, man. He could hear Sean's voice. I know, believe me, I know. Johnny spoke to himself as he finally opened the door and hopped out. He needed to get out of those clothes and get some rest before heading back to Mexico. After his shower, JJ finally sank into the bed of the dark motel room. The noise in his head along with the thoughts of his wrongdoings were turning in loop, causing him to be restless. He needed to drown them out, so finally the Cajun sat up and reached for the remote. Turning on the TV, Johnny sat up in the bed and laid his head back against the headboard. JJ knew he must do something else. He was going in the wrong direction, and for 5 years he was stuck in a rut. The Cajun missed his mom, his dog, and his old life. He felt awful. He once upheld the law and helped people. Now he was doing the complete opposite. He should have never left home or church. JJ needed to change not only what he was doing, but how he was doing it. The Cajun finally falls asleep to the low sound of the TV. The cabin. The morning light came peeping in the room slowly, causing Paige's eyes to open. She looked around the room, wiping the sleep from her eyes. She slowly pulled the covers back and placed her feet on the floor. She then tiptoed past the door to the bathroom. Paige peeked to see if Nate was still asleep, but she couldn't see. Paige went to use the toilet and came out of the bathroom. Her hair was all a mess, as she scratched it and walked back into the room. Paige yawned, and when she opened her eyes, she saw Nate standing in the doorway. She jumped at the sight of him, making Nate raise a brow. "I see you're up. Good. Get dressed. We start your firing lessons today," the soldier told her as he turned to walk out. Paige quickly got dressed and made her way outside. She walked down the small steps searching for him. She turned her head when she heard him crunching in the wet morning grass. Paige then walked around and followed him to the back of the cabin. They walked out in the small clearing, toward the back wooden fence where he had already set everything up. His dark glasses glinted in the sun. Paige squinted as she watched him, wondering why she was even taking a lesson. Nate set up a target behind the fence, by the tree line. He then made his way back toward her. Nate proceeded to teach her how to hold and load the gun. Paige did it a few times and got used to it before Nate taught her how to aim. He walked behind her as the gun trembled in her hands. She listened to him intently as he instructed her, but couldn't keep quiet for much longer. "I told you I wasn't going to kill him," Paige huffed. "Maybe not, but you need to learn to not only protect yourself, but to have my back in case something happens," Nate replied. "Open your dominant hand to expose the webbing between your index finger and thumb. Taking the pistol, which should still be pointing down, in your other hand, insert the grip of the pistol into the web of your dominant hand. With your thumb on one side of the grip, keep your middle, ring, and pinky fingers curled securely around the other side, just below the trigger guard. You are really gripping the gun only with the middle and ring fingers. The pinky is resting on the gun, but is not used to grip. Neither is the thumb used to grip the gun. The grip should be very tight. Hold the gun so tightly that your hand begins to shake, then relax a bit to stop the shaking. Keep your trigger, index finger safely outside the trigger guard, but ready to move into position. Wrap your non-dominant hand around the other side of the frame, aligning your two thumbs to point downward. This second hand, if used, is primarily for steadying the gun vertically and horizontally, and not for gripping the gun. Make sure both thumbs clear the slide, or hammer. Remember, this mechanism pops sharply backwards when the gun is fired, easily injuring a wayward thumb, Nate warned her. Paige did as she was told, and he inspected her hands. Good. Now hold the gun very firmly, leaving no air spaces between your hands and the grip. Paige's stomach was already in knots. She had never handled a gun before. Nate could tell, but he didn't let her know this. "How do I know you aren't gonna turn me into William?" It slipped out from the hundreds of thoughts that were swimming around in her head. "If I was going to turn you in, I would have let Derek bring you in. Or I would have drove you there myself." Nathaniel's eyes focused on her green eyes, so Paige would know he was truthful. He did not want to continue this conversation, so he continued his lesson instead. "Your feet should be shoulder width apart, with the foot opposite your dominant hand about a step past the other foot. Blade your body and stand with a slight lean forward, making sure you're firmly balanced. The elbow of your dominant arm should be almost completely straight. Similarly, your knees should not be locked, but slightly bent." He watched her do as she was told. "Now, the top of the front sight is level with the top of the rear sight. The rear sight appears evenly centered within the notch of the front sight. The front sight is the most important part of the sight picture. While the target and rear sight may be fuzzy, the front sight should be in focus. For practical shooting, the front sight should be just below the point of desired impact. For most target shooting, the front sight is aligned with the bottom edge of the bull's eye, the black area, while the point of impact is in the center. Either approach works, but you need to know how the gun is adjusted." Paige was getting antsy as he explained everything. She just wanted to shoot and get this over with. The gun started to sweat in her hands as she waited impatiently. Bring your weapon to bear on the target, maintaining your focus on the front sight. You should see the sharply focused front sight touching the bottom of the blurry, unfocused bull's eye. Only then do you insert the trigger finger into the trigger guard. Jerking the trigger will throw off your aim. It is best to time firing with your breathing. Take a breath, exhale half a breath, and then squeeze the trigger. Once you begin pulling the trigger, keep pulling it at a constant rate until the gun goes off. Be forewarned, the shot will probably startle you, so hold on to it, don't go dropping it. Paige laughed nervously. He placed his hands on hers to make sure everything was correct. He then stepped back a couple yards. "Do not rush, Make sure to retake aim because the recoil will offset your alignment. Now go ahead and fire, he told her. Of course, her aim was horrible. Nate stood behind her with his arms crossed watching her. When Paige finished the clip, he walked back behind her and continued to teach her. Chapter 8. William sat in the back of his limo, smoking a cigar. The smoke curled to the ceiling and fell, creating a haze in the car. The side door opened and in stepped a woman. Her long legs stretched as she crossed them. She sat beside him and smiled as she removed her glasses and put them on top of her long black hair. William reached on the side of him and handed her a file. She smiled, removing her leather gloves. "My dear Will," she said, taking the file, opening it and thumbing through it. William took another puff. "Oh my, is this the girl?" she said, taking out the picture and smiling. "She is cute." She purred and kissed it. It left a red lipstick stain around Paige's face. "The reason I called you Violet is because Derek was killed by the bull," he said, placing the cigar back in his mouth. "El Toro, my dear Nathaniel." She placed the photo back down. "Yes, I think she is with him," William replied. "She is with the bull." "You must be kidding me," the woman asked in shock. She then cracked a smile. "Marina will not like this news. Nate was a very special part of our organization. He must have finally snapped and became patriotic again," she said, thinking to herself. "Well, I don't know what that little brat is cooking up, but I want her dead. If he gets in the way, kill him, too." He paused and turned to face her. "That won't be a problem for you, will it, Violet?" he asked. "No, and what have I told you about using my real name?" she hissed. "Like I said, that nickname silliness is for the playground. I am not Marina, I don't play those games. Just get it done." He snapped back at her. "Oh, so fussy, you need a vacation or something, huh?" She chuckled. "Violet, enough jokes, I need this handled before the end of the month, can you do it or not?" he yelled. "It will be my pleasure. I need to know what is so special about this girl that has the bull so captivated. So much that he would turn his back on us." She thought out loud. "Look, if the great Vespa can't do this, let me know. I'll get someone else." He joked to her. "No, no." She swatted his arm playfully. "Blondie and the bull's horns will be yours by the end of the month. Marina sent me to help pay the merging and all." "Good, don't get carried away like Derek did and get killed," William said. "That stupid oaf was always drunk. Of course he was no match for the bull, but this Vespa, her stinger is always sharp." She cracked a smile. "I have a small question. Why do they call you the Wasp, Violet?" She thought for a moment. "Maybe it's because I'm quick-tempered and hard to put down. Also, Queen Bee was too overused, so I took Wasp, and plus, bees die right after they sting you. But a wasp, well, they keep on hitting, honey," she said, smirking as she opened the door to exit the limo. He smiled and watched her exit. She blew him a kiss and strutted down the street with a huge grin. This will be so much fun, she thought to herself. Across town, Mitch busted in the FBI's building office. He stomped right into an office without even knocking. The younger, dirty blonde FBI agent jumped from behind his desk as Mitch busted open his door. "Mr. Glass," he said to Mitch. "Don't Mr. Glass me. It's been almost a week and you still haven't found Paige." Mitch yelled at the man. "Excuse me, sir, but you can't just come in my office demanding things," the agent told him. Mitch slammed his fist on his desk, rattling it. "Okay, Mr. Glass. Enough." The man jumped up. Mitch lowered his tone. "Agent Jefferson, please. Paige was my responsibility. Her dad entrusted me to keep an eye on her." The agent walked around his desk. "Look, I understand that. We're doing our best to find Ms. Welsh, but with you storming in here like that, it's not going to help the cause. Now, if you have any more information you can think of to tell me that will help, say it. If not, please sir, let me do my job." The agent watched Mitch wipe his face in frustration. Agent Jefferson shut the door and pulled out a seat for Mitch. Mitch sat down slowly, avoiding eye contact. I know, I'm sorry for my outburst, but I need to find her. Not only for hers and my sakes, but also for the company's. The agent sat back down and adjusted his tie. Well, we got a match on the prints on the bodyguard's body. They matched with prints belonging to the dead hitman found a couple blocks away. What I'm trying to figure out is, if this hitman killed the bodyguard, who killed him? And whoever killed him must have Paige. Now, Mr. Glass, we have been working round the clock. The agent looked over to Mitch. Mitch listened to the agent intently. So, you think someone has her? Mitch asked. The agent nodded his head. But, who? I'm sure if William did, he would have asked for her ransom or something. Mitch told the agent. I'm not sure, Mr. Glass, but we will find her. The agent reassured Mitch. The cabin. As the week lingered on, Paige excelled at her training. Her accuracy at shooting got better, and Nate was also teaching her basic self-defense. Nate wanted to make sure that if she got into trouble, she could handle herself. During this week, Paige went from being a frightened young girl to being an unyielding maiden preparing for battle. She hardened her heart and pushed back all emotions. Nate could see the change in her. It was almost like it was overnight. Even though Nate had agreed to help train her, he secretly hated himself. He was taking this sweet and innocent girl and molding her into something like himself. He really didn't want to do this, but he didn't want to go back on his word. Could he really deal with the fact that he turned someone into something like himself? Could he really live with that? Good, again, he said as she charged him. Paige threw a couple punches, but Nate blocked them. The two were in the living room with the furniture all pushed out the way. Paige lunged again, but he gripped her by the arm and used his hip to flip her. She landed on the ground with a hard thud. Nate smiled and turned to walk away. As she lay there, she thought for a moment. Should she really go through with this? Was it really all worth it? Would she have the strength to complete this objective? Could she take a person's life if it came to it? She grew angry at herself for even thinking this. Paige pushed the thoughts to the back of her mind. Now was not the time to think, now was the time to act. She let out a faint scream of anger and used her leg to trip him. He fell to his stomach and quickly turned over. Paige quickly got up and pinned his shoulders down. Don't let your emotions control you. He yelled out of breath. Why not? I pinned you. She yelled back, panting. Paige's hands gripped his shoulders tightly. He looked down with his eyes motioning her to look as well. She glanced down, following his eyes to see a knife at her stomach. Because you lose focus, he said. Paige grunted angrily, getting off of him. She paced the floor out of breath. I'm never going to get this. William is having his monthly meeting next Friday. She wiped the sweat from her face. The two had been training non-stop since they arrived at the cabin. Training as well as gathering evidence and information on William Green and all of the people involved. The two would often bicker like a married couple, butting heads and cursing each other out. Well, Nate would curse. Paige was far from the same young woman that arrived. Between the late nights researching and the long days of training, she was evolving. She just wanted this to be done and over. She would often rush, and Nate would have to tell her to take her time. He knew she didn't have the time, but if he was going to teach her, it was going to the right way. His way. Nate got off the ground, walking over to her. Well, you wanted to learn. It takes time. You can't just wake up one day and say, hey, I want to be a contract killer, he said sarcastically. Paige stopped pacing and whipped her head around, her brunette hair slapping against her wet face. I never wanted to learn. I wanted you to help me take William down with evidence, and with what you have on Marina and William is enough. He has plans on taking the company. I have to stop this. Paige then pauses. Why am I explaining myself? It's not like you care. As long as you get paid. She placed her hands on her hips and looked at the floor. You're right, I don't care. The faster I can get you trained, the faster I can do my job. Remember, they're going to be after me as much as you, or did you forget? Nathaniel spat out as he made his way to the door. What do you mean? Paige looked up to see him walking away. You think you're the only one who is at risk? Whose life was turned upside down? He paused and turned to look at her. They are after me as much as you. I told you how deep I am in this, and you are as well. It goes to the core of the CIA and spreads all over the world. Those kind of people, you must kill before they kill you. You change, and for the worse. Do you really want to live like that? Become a monster, like me? You choose to throw it all away, your future, your innocence. Nathaniel walked to her, towering over her again like the day in the cafe. This time Paige was not intimidated by his height. She practically tried to get in his face. I told you. I want justice, Nathaniel. Whatever it takes. She snapped back. Nate inhaled deeply, disappointed in her decision. He shook his head. Well, then I need to take you with me. One of the guys has some information for me. Also, so that you can get a feel for the real thing. So that I know you are ready and don't choke when it comes to the big boss. This will determine if you can actually do what you say you are willing to do. He turned, walking toward the back of the cabin. Paige watched him a bit, eyes squinting, before following him. Chapter 9. William Green sat behind his desk, on the phone, in his large office. He sat back in his chair and tapped a pen on his desk, out of annoyance. Suddenly, his office doors burst open as he heard his secretary fussing. He sat up in the leather chair and dropped his pen, hearing a Russian voice fussing back. I don't need an appointment. I come and go as I please. William Green then looked up and saw 3 Ukrainians entering the room. The 2 taller men stood by the door, pushing his secretary out. A middle-aged man made his way toward William's desk and sat down. The Ukraine adjusted his suit coat as William hastily hung up the phone. William looked at the 2 others closing the door, and his eyes fell on the one that sat at his desk. The leader of the group of Ukraine sat eyeing William. He was a bit smaller than the others, but still had a stone-cold stare. His blue eyes fixed on William Green. A moment passed, and he sat up in the chair playing with William Green's nameplate on his desk. William watched him without saying a word. Why don't I have my software? Why don't I have my guns? He asked, pushing William's nameplate off the desk and watching it fall. His Russian accent thick, William had to listen hard to understand him. The 2 other guys continued fussing in Russian at the secretary through the door. The leader turned around and yelled at them in Russian. The men finally quit squabbling and stood by quietly. The man turned back around and looked at William. Well, Mr. Green? He asked, waiting for an answer. Well, for one, who do you think you are? Bursting into my office demanding things. The Ukraine snapped back before William could continue to run his mouth. Who am I? Who am I? You promise software, and don't deliver. You promise guns, no guns. I am a man looking for what I paid good money for. The man calmed down and sat back in the chair. He intertwined his fingers and sat them on his chest. Mr. Mikhailov, I am aware of the delay. Things have grown complicated. William tried to explain. How is complicated? I pay you for software. You give me software. How do you expect me to take over my country without it? I pay you a lot of American money, Mr. Green. Mr. Alvarez sent help. Even one of our own was sent in to help you. Mikhailov raised his voice a bit, speaking about Vespa. William tried to keep the peace. I understand that, I promise you. You'll get what you paid for by the end of the month. William told him. The Ukraine rose from his seat, adjusting his jacket again. He stared down at William, motionless. I better, not only will my rebels come after you, but the cartel. You agreed to work with us, promised us so many things, you better fulfill your words or you will be the one sleeping with the fishes, he said, making fun of William's Italian ancestry. William bit his tongue in anger, but kept his mouth closed. William watched the 2 Russians open the door for their boss. They exited his office. William picked up his phone so quickly it almost fell. Laura. Get me Vespa on the phone, ASAP, he yelled at his secretary. On the other end, Laura held the phone and watched the Ukrainians leave. Mikhailov smiled and winked at her as he passed. Laura stared back at him as they walked out. She shook off his gaze. "Yes, Mr. Green," she said, hanging up the phone. Laura looked down, dialing the phone. Mikhailov came back and knocked on Laura's desk. Laura was startled and held her chest. "You know, if and when your boss goes down, you can always come work for me." He smirked, checking her out. She forced a smile on her face. "I'll be sure to remember that." She turned away and continued to do her job. Mikhailov smiled and finally walked out of the office again. He reached into his pocket and gave Marina a call. "Marina, I spoke with William. He should have everything in order by next week. If not, I promise you, I will send my brother Nicole." Mikhailov hissed. "He will make that Italian wish he never spoke false promises." Mikhailov slid into the back of his car and switched the phone to his other ear. "Mikhailov, I understand you are upset, but please give me your faith as your father gave it. I will have my devils handle it. You should know this, as one of your own, Vespa is on the task in helping William in this matter. The kinks are being worked out. Remember, Rome wasn't built in a day, and bringing this organization together takes time." Marina tried to assure the rebel group's new leader's mind. His father had recently passed away, leaving him in control. Mikhailov was not as patient as his old man, but he was still loyal to the great cause. After Marina hung up with Mick, she tried to call Nathaniel again. For the past month or so she could not get a hold of him. She wanted to hear it from Nate's mouth, if the rumors of his betrayal was true. The cabin. Paige and Nathaniel's feet trampled through the dead leaves in the yard, as they made their way out back. It was autumn, so there was a small chill in the air. The trees were changing colors and shedding their leaves. Paige stopped and crossed her arms, as she was still mad at the fight they had. As she kicked at some leaves on the ground in frustration, Nathaniel took the gun from behind his back and held it out to her. Paige stared at it, then looked back up at him. "I know how to shoot." Paige uncrossed her arms. He didn't say a word, he just held the gun out. She rolled her eyes and snatched it from his hands. She walked up and fired at the target, hitting it dead center. She emptied the clip, then turned to look at him. "See? I know how to shoot, okay?" She sat the gun on the post. Nathaniel gave her a look. "Yeah, you may think that." Nathaniel slowly walked over towards her. "Reload," he demanded. Paige shook her head and did as she was told. "Look, I don't see." Paige grew silent when she felt his presence behind her. Nathaniel was inches away from her. He looked down as she faced the targets. "You're hitting a stationary, non-human target. There is pressure or motion." Which means he stopped talking as he reached his arms around, raising hers. Paige was a bit startled at first as she tried to figure out what he was getting at. The only time he was this close to her was when he was fighting. Nathaniel pressed his body against her. Paige swallowed hard, her eyes moving, wondering what he was doing behind her. His hands wrapped around hers and the gun. Nate pressed his face against her, he was speaking in a low voice. Which means no stress, distractions, or he stepped back. No anxiety or excitement. He paused for a minute. "Fire. Come on, they have men coming at all sides." He yelled, firing bullets on each side of her. Paige yelled at him, "Are you crazy?" "No, but others are." Another shot rang. "And they don't care, they want you dead. You either shoot them or they shoot you." He screamed, firing more shots as Paige tried to focus. She took a quick breath to calm herself. She fired the gun. It was a bit off but still in the center. Nathaniel's eyes went from her to her target. Nate reloaded and fired around her again. Paige's bullet flew and hit the target a little off center. "I'm putting you in a stressful, distracting situation." She continued to fire, but she wasn't hitting the center. She was way off. Her mind was on Nathaniel's bullets. "Fire again," he demanded. "What are you waiting for?" Hit the target. The gun emptied, and she reached for the extra clip. The clip and the gun fumbled in her hands. "Better hurry and reload," he yelled. Paige finally loaded the gun and widened her eyes. Paige was finally able to push everything back and fire on the target. She hit close to the center as she emptied the magazine while letting out a frustrated yell. Good, Nathaniel said. You're ready. He turned and quickly walked back to the house. Paige turned and watched him walk back. Paige was left there trying to wrap her mind around what just happened. She leaned against the post trying to catch her breath. Nathaniel quickly let himself into the cabin. His own heart was racing. Was he letting his emotions get in the way? Was he overstepping his boundaries? He needed to clear his head. He needed to stay focused on the job at hand and not worry about anything else. He walked over to the kitchen and picked up his bag from the floor. He set it on the table and began loading it up. He shoved the ammo in the bag. He was angry at himself. He was starting to have feelings for Paige. He didn't know why, but he did. Nate pushed her because he cared for her. He couldn't change it now. What was done was done. He filled the bag up and walked to the door. Paige slowly made her way up the stairs. Nathaniel walked out the door. He walked towards the car. She watched him open the trunk and stuff the bag in. He just passed her up and went about his business like nothing happened. Paige looked down at the porch. The gun still in her hands. She couldn't believe he could act like nothing happened. What if he doesn't care? She asked herself, gripping the gun tighter. Ready? Nate asked, unlocking the car. His voice made her jerk out of her thoughts. Paige nodded as she walked to the car. Nathaniel started the car and waited for her to get in. As Nate watched Paige make her way to the car, he looked up at his reflection in the rear-view mirror, hating himself. He inhaled deeply, trying to clear his mind, as Paige opened the door and sat down. She buckled her seatbelt and looked down at her lap. She couldn't face him. He put the car in reverse and pulled out of the driveway onto the road. Chapter 10. Nathaniel pulled up into a parking garage and parked the car. He looked at her as he removed the keys from the ignition. Paige's head lowered to look at her hands in her lap. She avoided eye contact with him. Nate sighed as he reached in the back seat. Pulling out a folder, the bowl, and handed it to her. She took it slowly from Nate and watched him get out the car. Paige unbuckled her seatbelt and got out as well. She watched Nate pop the trunk and get the bag of ammunition and guns out. Nate then closed the trunk and locked the car as he started walking towards the entrance of the building. Paige sighed and followed him. She opened the folder, looking at its contents. So, this is the man who has the rest of the information? She asked, looking at a few pictures of a man. Yes, he will be at the cafe across the street in 30 minutes. Nathaniel passed up the elevator and opened the door to the stairs. Paige stopped by the elevator. What's wrong with the elevator? She asked, pointing to it. Nate looked at it, then her. I don't like them. He mumbled as he started to walk up the stairs. Paige made a face of cluelessness as she followed him. But, why? She asked again. Why must you pry? He asked as he climbed the stairs. Because I want to know why we are wasting time walking up these stairs. He stopped and turned to look down at her. They're confining. Paige smiled. You mean to tell me you're claustrophobic? She asked. He didn't answer. He just shook his head and walked up the stairs. Okay, Paige said to herself. Big bad bull scared of an elevator, she laughed softly. They finally made their way to the top of the roof. He walked to the edge and looked down at the cafe across the street. He plopped his bag on the ground and unzipped it. Paige stood behind him, waiting for orders. The wind was blowing, slightly tossing her hair about. He took out his gun and started to piece it together. Paige watched him with her hands on her hips. She began to feel nervous. She bit down on her lower lip and held her cross in her hands, the necklace running over her lips quickly. You're nervous. Nate spoke to her without even looking. No, why? She lied, still playing with her necklace. 'Cause when you get nervous you start playing with your necklace, he stated. Paige looked down at her hand that held the necklace. She dropped it and crossed her arms. It's okay to be nervous, he told her, setting the sights. Paige pushed her hair out her face and walked over to him. So, that's the cafe? She asked, looking down over the building. Yes, he sits in the table by the window every day at noon. He put the gun on a tripod to steady it. Come set up your sights, he told her. She nodded her head and walked behind the gun, messing with it. He walked to the edge and took out his binoculars, watching for the man. So, why are we over here and looking at him through a gun scope? Paige asked, but Nate just looked down at his watch and frowned. He then looked on the street for the man. I thought you said he would be here at noon, Paige asked, looking up at Nate. Nate turned to her. Yes, at the corner table by the window, he told her. She looked again and shook her head at him. Nate made a face and walked over to her. Let me see, he said, pushing her aside. He focused in with the scope to the table. He noticed on the table was a knife. They said he would. His words dropped when noticed the wasp engraved on it. SH. He yelled, grabbing the gun. He started to pack up his things quickly. What is going on? Paige asked, trying to figure out what was happening. Suddenly a bullet ricocheted off the ledge, barely missing her. Nate tackled Paige to the ground. Stay down and follow me, he told her as they crawled to the door. What the heck is going on? She yelled, as she scooted her elbows across the gravel. It's a setup, he said, making it to the door. He slowly reached up to turn the handle. Another bullet flew and hit the door, almost hitting his hand. He lowered his hand quickly. Whoever is shooting, they suck, she said, screaming in their direction. She is toying with us. He shook his head as he grabbed Paige's head, pushing it down. Stay down, he yelled at her. Paige asked as Nate finally reached up and opened the door. Vespa. She was probably here to kill us, he said, waving to her to follow him. Paige slung the bag over her shoulder and followed him down the stairs. They reached the second floor and Nate peeked out the door. Okay, look, we're going to go through here, see if I can find out where she is set up, he said, out of breath. Sweat was pouring down his face. He wiped his brow as he reached out for the door. Paige's heart was pounding as she watched him slowly open the door. He peeked through and saw the coast was clear. He looked back at her and told her to follow him quietly. As they walked out of the door, into the building, the elevator dinged and opened. Well, Capelli El Toro, hats off to the bullet woman's voice, and the sound of a gun clicked. They stopped and turned to face her. Nate cursed to himself when he saw the woman. Paige stayed behind Nathaniel, peeking from behind him to see the female. Oh, Nathaniel, you are too predictable. I know you hate elevators. How else would I have caught up with you? She smiled and noticed Paige peeking around. Oh, is that her? The little blonde? Well, not anymore. I must say brunette fits you better. I see why you keep her around. She stared at Paige, then to Nate. She is very cute. She licked her lips. Nate and Vespa squared off. Paige didn't know what to do. She looked at her and then to Nate. So, you are here to take us out. Marina knows already, Nate said, turning, then slowly inching back to the stairs. Paige stayed behind him the whole time, reached onto the back of his shirt. Well, of course, what did you expect? Marina just doesn't want to admit it. She is very prideful. Oh, nothing personal, dearie. I am just surprised you would give everything up for a spoiled little brat like her, Vespa said to Paige. That's funny, Nathaniel said, inching closer to the door. Oh, you think because it was you, I would turn it down? She asked. Nate nodded and flashed a fake smile. He was just trying to get her to run her mouth and not notice him inching back towards the stairs. Vespa laughed at him. You think because it was you? Really? She said, laughing. Paige shook her head and rolled her eyes. Her fingers still gripped Nate's shirt. Oh, you thought I missed you? She continued to laugh. Oh, baby, she moaned to herself. Paige rolled her eyes. Clearly these two had history, and Vespa was a huge drama queen. Nathaniel frowned back at her before glancing behind at Paige. What, Nathaniel, didn't you miss me? Vespa asked. Don't flatter yourself, Vespa, he snapped back. Oh, was I not good enough? She asked, pouting. Her sour face made his stomach turn. He wanted so badly to smack it off her. Well, sorry, but I do not miss you. Queen Bee, thought you ruled the world. Sorry, but the stinger just wasn't for me. Plus, you're not even all that hot in the first place. The only reason we got together that night was because I was drunk, very, very, very drunk, and I regretted it. A Coyote Ugly situation. He knew that would piss her off, but he didn't care. Vespa shook her head, trying to keep calm. She knew what he was doing, trying to anger her. Oh, you see, your problem was you thought you gave me wings, honey. You were good, but not that good. But then again, she touched her lips with her fingers. I wouldn't mind giving it another try. You always gave your all, never giving up. How about you and I make amends? Huh? Take this girl to William together. Cash in the bounty, go to a rodeo or two. Vespa tilted her head, looking him up and down, licking her lips. Nathaniel reached the door and turned the knob slowly. He swallowed hard, hoping she didn't notice him. I'm sure we can lie about the Irishman. Marina would understand, I am sure. You know, I thought you were goner, he spoke, smiling at her sweetly. Paige looked at him, thinking he was about to join forces with this woman. Her heart sank for a moment. Paige gripped his shirt tighter, her knuckles turning white from it. Nathaniel, Paige whispered as she looked at him and then to Vespa. Vespa thought the same as she smiled. Nate got the door open slowly. But the bitch came back, she couldn't stay the F away. He yelled as he pushed Paige in the stairs and closed the door. At the same time, Vespa screamed, raising her gun to shoot at Nathaniel. He quickly ran down the hall, doing his best to avoid her bullets as they hit the wall. They screamed past him, leaving a trail. The wall broke apart as the bullets hit them. The dust filled the air, leaving a cloud. Vespa emptied the clips and screamed as she ran after him. She paused when she lost sight of him. She threw her empty clip on the ground in frustration. You could have done this differently, my dear Bulla, her voice echoing through the hall. She fumbled, reloading her gun, her steps growing ever closer to him. Nathaniel rounded the corner, breathing heavy. He pushed plastic and other debris out his way. It looked like that part of the building was being remodeled. Some of the walls were half-built, and tools, along with paint buckets, lined the halls. He leaned against the wall, almost knocking the tools over. Nathaniel felt a sharp pain in his side when he pressed against the wall. He reached his hand under his jacket slowly and almost screamed. Nate winced in pain, trying to keep quiet. He had been hit. Nate cursed at himself when he saw his fingers stained crimson with blood. Nate straightened up as he heard Vespa's heels clacking closer. Lowering his hand, blood dripped on the floor. Paige got up quickly and grabbed the bag. She ran down the stairs towards the parking garage. Dang hitmen. Vespa. What the hell kind of freaking name is that? She cursed to herself. Her heart was pounding. She prayed Nate was okay. She knew this woman meant business. Paige almost tripped on the last step, but she caught herself. Calm yourself, Paige, she told herself as she reached the door. Paige sat the bag down, unzipping it. She reached in and took out a handgun, making sure it was loaded. She slowly opened the door and stuck out the gun, aiming at anything that moved. Her heart raced. What would she find? She thought to herself. Bad thoughts flooded her mind. Paige slowly made her way out the door. She looked around for Vespa and Nate. Vespa rounded the corner, but Nate was there. He quickly tackled her to the floor. Vespa's head hit the back wall as Nate's hand gripped her wrist, his other hand on her shoulder, pinning her to the wall. Nate slammed Vespa's hand into the wall repeatedly, trying to knock the gun out her hand. After a few bangs, the gun dropped out of her hand to the floor. The metal clanged on the floor loudly. Nate kicked it away. The gun went skidding across the floor. Vespa wiggled her wrist free when he was distracted with pushing the gun away. With all her might, she backhanded him in the face. The force made his head spin, but he still had one hand pinned on her. He slowly turned his face to look her in the eyes. She laughed in his face with a wicked smile. This pissed Nathaniel off. He screamed as he threw a punch towards her face to shut her up. She dodged it and he hit the wall. Nate's fist went through the drywall. He let her go and struggled to get his hand out. Vespa used her leg, placing it in his wounded side and pushed him. Nate yelled in pain and almost fell backwards, but he caught himself. She tried to kick him again, but he caught her leg. He wrapped his arm around Vespa's leg and held on. Nate went to punch her again, but the blood loss made him a bit slow. Vespa blocked it with one arm. With her other arm she uppercut him and he flew across the hall. He hit the wall with a thud. Paige stood in the middle of the parking garage turning in circles trying to think. Paige grew dizzy and fell faint. She stopped and looked at the elevator. Paige wanted to go back and help Nathaniel. She knew he would be pissed. She looked at the car, then to the elevator again. He can be mad all he wants, at least he will be alive, she thought to herself. She ran to the elevator, her finger pushing the button frantically. "Come on," she said, bouncing up and down, looking around. The gun began to sweat in her hand. She jiggled it and the metal rattled. The elevator finally opened, and she ran in. Nathaniel almost went through the weak wall. "You're willing to lay it all on the line for this girl," Vespa said out of breath, "for a spoiled little brat." Nathaniel had lost a lot of blood. It dripped on the floor. He was almost to the point of passing out. He slid down the wall, leaving a trail down with him. He hit the ground with a thud. He held his side and looked up at Vespa. He spit out blood at her feet, her words still echoing in his mind. Nate slowly looked up as Vespa walked towards him. Vespa knelt slowly and picked up her gun. While she was squatted down, she reached out and gripped his chin. He tried to get out of her grasp, but he was too weak. "You are pathetic. We could have been such a team, you and I." She let him go as she slowly stood to her feet. She reached out and pointed the gun to his face. Nate looked up past the gun into Vespa's cold eyes. "I'll tell the boss's daughter." Her bull was put out to pass her. She grinned. Before Vespa could pull the trigger, bullets rang out toward her. Vespa ducked and ran a little way down the hall. She reached the end of the other hall, almost tripping on her heels. She jumped behind the wall and sat against it. Paige still shot at Vespa as she briskly walked down the hall, the gun shaking in her hands with each shot. Paige's face was ridden with anger. She held back her tears as she made her way to Nate. Paige stopped shooting and bent down to check on Nate. She could hear Vespa cackling down the hall. "Nathaniel," Paige whimpered, lifting his head. He barely opened his eyes to look at her. She noticed him holding his side. Paige's hand slowly took hold of his jacket and moved it a bit. When her eyes glanced on the wound, she had to put her hand over her mouth. She almost burst into tears, but she held it together. She let the jacket go and it folded over his wound. Suddenly bullets shot back at them. Paige covered her head for a moment. She screamed and shot back. "Doesn't she ever die?" she cried out after emptying the clip. A couple tears ran down her face. Vespa shot back again and then stopped for a moment. No, I can't lose you too. I can't do this by myself." Paige closed her eyes. "Oh, God, I need your help." She gripped her cross around her neck. Paige shook her head, trying to figure out what to do. She opened her eyes and hovered over him. Panic took over for a moment when she saw his wound again. Paige closed her eyes and took a deep breath. All she knew was she had to get him out of there. Paige reached out and tried to lift him up. He hollered in pain as he gripped her shirt. "Just go," he whispered in her ear, and he held on her shirt. No, I'm not leaving you," Paige yelled at him with a raspy voice. Nathaniel knew she was stubborn and wouldn't leave. He used her to help himself up. Vespa tried to listen to them. She pointed her gun and continued to shoot at them, laughing. Nate wrapped his arm around Paige's shoulder. He began to hop down the hall, holding his side. Each step took his breath away. Bullets flew past them as they made their way to the other elevator. Paige pressed the button and the doors opened instantly. Nathaniel mumbled as she helped him inside. "Sorry, but there is no way I can carry you down the steps," she said, grunting and trying to hold on to him. The doors closed, and she placed him against the wall. He almost fell over, but she reached out to steady him. She quickly removed her jacket and balled it up. She slowly moved his jacket and pressed it to his wound. Nate let out a scream of pain, his breathing heavy as he balled up his fist. Sorry, sorry, she kept repeating herself. Nate looked down at her as she tended to him. The elevator stopped, and the doors opened. Paige placed his hand over the jacket to hold her jacket in place. She then wrapped his other arm around her shoulders again. They made their way slowly to the car. Paige looked around to make sure no one was following them. Nathaniel could feel himself slipping away. He had been hurt before, but not this badly. He was amazed he was still conscious. They finally made it to the car, and Paige leaned him against the side of it. She reached around and opened it. The door flung open. It began to shut again, but Paige stuck out her foot and stopped it. She hobbled around, bringing Nate into the car. He fell in and groaned, his foot still hanging out. She lifted it up and put it in the car. She shut the door and ran around to the other side. She flung open the driver door and hopped in. She grabbed the keys and fumbled with them, her hands shaking and full of blood. "Oh God. Oh God," she said, trying to find the ignition. She finally started up the car as Nate was slumped over the divvy of the car. Paige peeled out the parking garage, making the tires spin as she pressed the pedal to the floor. She made it onto the road finally. Who the hell was that Nathaniel? Paige said breathlessly. She couldn't hold her mouth shut any longer. Her face flushed red and she started breathing heavy. "Just somebody that I used to know," he spoke softly. He tried to sit up but couldn't move. "We need to get you to a hospital." Paige looked over to him really quick, then back to the road. No cops, too many questions," he mumbled, putting sentences together. Paige stepped on the gas, running a red light. "Well, what do I do, Nathaniel?" His name left her lips slowly. She kept looking at him in the road. "I told you this job comes with high risks." He screamed in pain as he adjusted himself. "Nathaniel, I don't know what to do. I know you told me to be calm and all, but I'm not. I don't know what to do." She started to cry in panic. She reached up for her necklace, but noticed it was gone. Her heart sank lower. He slowly reached out and touched her hand to calm her. She felt his hand on hers and she looked over at him again. He looked at her with his sad eyes. "Go to a hotel," he whispered. He then let go and held his side. Paige looked at her arm where he'd left a bloody handprint. The fear built inside her. She was so scared she was going to lose him. An hour later, the police and FBI swarmed the building, some taking pictures and others speaking with the building owner. Agent Jefferson walked around with the other cops. "So, what do you think happened here?" one cop asked. "Not sure," Agent Jefferson told the cop. He followed the trail of bullets and blood. He scratched his chin, trying to figure out exactly what went on. "Agent," one of the cops called out for him. The agent walked towards the cop, who was in the elevator. "What do you make of this, sir?" He held up a silver necklace with a cross. Agent Jefferson took the tweezers that held the necklace. He studied it for a moment. The silver shined in the light. The agent pulled out his phone and took a picture of it. He handed the necklace back to the cop for him to bag it as evidence. The agent texted the picture to Mr. Glass. Minutes later, he received a phone call. "Yes, Mr. Glass," he answered. "That's Paige's necklace." "Where did you find it?" Mitch asked. "I found it at the building on 5th, the one being remodeled." "Now, are you sure this is Paige's?" he asked. "Yes, she never takes it off. Her father gave it to her," Mitch told the agent. The worry in his voice took over. "Is she there? Is she okay?" he asked. "Mr. Glass, this is the only thing we found. If I find out anything else, you'll be the first to know." The agent hung up with Mitch. He tapped the phone on his mouth, trying to figure out the whole situation. "I need prints and blood samples ASAP," the agent yelled at the officers. "Yes, sir," the officers and forensics team told him. He walked out of the building and to his car. He needed to find this girl. He feared she was in trouble. Mitch paced back and forth in the den of the Welsh home, the phone gripped tightly in his hands. He feared the worst. Could Paige be dead? Could William Green have her hostage? What was he to do? He asked himself. All he could do was wait and pray by the phone. The phone rang again. He quickly answered it. Hello? Yes, this is Mr. Glass, he said. Mr. Glass, this is Mr. Green's secretary. Mr. Green would like to have a meeting with you and your fellow board members on Friday, she told him. That's in 2 days, he shouted. Yes, sir, I'm sorry for the short notice, but it is urgent, she explained. Very well, email me the pertinent information. Mitch hung up the phone. He cursed and stormed out of the room. Across town, Paige burst through the hotel room door. She dragged Nathaniel in with her. Better off without you, should have never brought you, Nathaniel mumbled. She plopped him on the bed. The words hurt, but she didn't pay it any mind. She ran to close and lock the door. She then turned on the light next to the bed. He began to fall over and she caught him. Paige helped him scoot to the headboard and propped him against it. She made sure he wouldn't fall over again and rushed into the bathroom. She grabbed a towel and looked for a first aid kit. This is what you wanted. Did I live up to your expectations? Probably wondering what you got into, he screamed in pain. Paige ran back into the room and tossed the kit and things on the bed. She reached over and took his shirt off slowly. She tossed it on the floor and began to clean him up. Nate watched her. You wanted this, are you happy now? Nate continued to mumble at her. Shut up. Just shut up, okay, she screamed at him. He laughed at her and laid his head on the headboard as she cleaned him and stitched him up. Paige was tired of him putting her down and yelling at her. Enough was enough, and she let him know that with her stare.